We shot this film entirely during the genocide. We expect Palestinians to suffer violence because we've just seen it for so many decades. It's normal at this point, and it's not normal. It shouldn't be normal. I think that the world has become so desensitized to violence in general, but specifically violence against Palestinians. So often we see the violence from just a very kind of cold, factual point of view. You know, we see maybe we hear the numbers of how many Palestinians were killed or injured. And so often the news doesn't even say that Palestinians were killed. They say Palestinians died. This very passive voice that doesn't really tell you how they died or who, was responsible for their death. So I wanted to show not just the physical violence, I wanted to show the different kinds of violence that Palestinians suffer under occupation. And I wanted to show the emotional impact of that violence on human beings, because that's the part that I think is left out of the news media. That's the part that the world doesn't get to understand or see. And I think that if we see that, it makes a massive difference. There's a scene in the film that is actually inspired by something that I witnessed as a child with my own father. And this scene, you really see the emotional violence that's perpetrated against Palestinians, the humiliation, the harassment, and you see the emotional impact on the person, on this Palestinian man. And then you see the impact of the relationship between him and his son, because his son witnesses this moment of violence. And the father that he looked up to as a hero, suddenly he sees his father differently, and it impacts their relationship for, the rest of their lives. This one moment of violence, you see how it completely changes their relationship. And so I wanted the world to really see the effects of violence on people, because like I said, that is the part that, we don't really get to see. But as a Palestinian, we Palestinians are deeply familiar with how the violence impacts us daily and how it impacts our lives and our families. We prepped the entire film in Palestine. I spent around 5 months on the ground working with my local crew. And of course, I had some foreign crew arrive throughout the summer of 2023. And then again, in early October of 2023, we had done a tremendous amount of work. We had found all of our locations. We began construction on some of the locations. We had a giant warehouse of carefully crafted props and set dressing, curated from all of the different time periods. And of course, we cast the whole film. We were really very ready. We were 2 weeks away from shooting when October the 7th happened. And of course, within a few days, we realized that we weren't going to be able to make the film in Palestine as planned. At that point, we were based in Ramallah in the West Bank. And West Bank cities were being sealed off. Checkpoints were closing. Things were very, very tense. And we were hearing rumors that even the border with Jordan was going to close. So we weren't going to be able to get out if we stayed. Of course, my foreign crew was very scared. Their families were worried, so we had to start evacuating people. And we didn't know where to go or whether we'd be able to continue. Of course, all of the financing that we spent in Palestine, it was already spent, and we weren't able to shoot there, so we had to start completely over. We went to Cyprus, where we were always planning to shoot a small percentage of the film, around 10% of the film. We had to add weeks of pre-production because the producers there were not ready for us. But we eventually started shooting there in November of 2023, late November. And I kept hoping we'd be able to return to Palestine. But, the situation just escalated, as we all know. So we ended up going to Jordan, where we had to start completely over. We had to location scout all over again. We had to add weeks and weeks of pre-production. I had to replace some of my crew who no longer were able to work on the film or were too scared to work on the film after that point. So it was a very dramatic experience, I would say, and one that is really unheard of in film. It's very unusual to have to re-prep a film entirely once again. We really made the film in a state of crisis. We were in a logistical crisis. We were in a financial crisis. We kept having to start and stop and start and stop. We eventually shot more than 50% of the film in Jordan, in the refugee camps in the north of Jordan. which was great because we were able to, work with the Palestinian refugee community in really what is the telling of their own story. And then after Jordan, we had to stop for many months, look for more financing, figure out where to go next. And finally, we finished the film in Greece. So it took us about 11 months from the time we started production until the time we finally wrapped production. That's how many times we had to start and stop. And, so normally a production that would have taken us maybe 3 months took 11 months. It was very emotionally taxing. But it was also a gift to have this movie, for all of us really, to be able to pour ourselves into this film while we were watching a genocide in Gaza, to feel that we were able to do something, to really tell the story of Palestine and how everything began in 1948. Because what started in 1948, and even before 1948, but that's the year that, we Palestinians say that's the Nakba, what started then really never ended. So we really poured ourselves into this film, all of our love, our grief, our compassion, our anger, we poured it into the film. And in a way, it was beautiful to be able to create during a time of such destruction. I wanted to highlight that beauty. So often all the world sees is our suffering, or is the violence, sees Palestinians as victims of violence or as perpetrators of violence. I'm Palestinian American. I grew up mostly in the diaspora, returning to Palestine often as a kid. And I wanted to show the beauty of the culture, the beauty of the people, the beauty of the poetry, the beauty of what we had before it was all lost. Because I think it's hard for the world to understand what we're fighting for when no one knows really what we had, how we lived before. I feel like the world doesn't know the Palestinian narrative. It has been just erased. It has been suppressed. It has been denied. So how can you know what we lost if you don't know what we had? So it was very important to me to recreate Palestine authentically, especially the 1948 part of it, because we've never seen urban Palestine in 1948. We've never seen this time period. So I wanted to, we worked very hard to recreate that. And of course, that became so much more challenging once we had to flee Palestine. We found ways to subversively shoot in Palestine. We did some remote shooting so that we were able to capture some images from Jaffa and then totally, rebuild them in 3D visual effects so that we could, make them period appropriate, so that we could really show Jaffa in 1948. There's a whole shot of the clock tower square, for example. And we shot that in VFX and then, had to recreate it for 1948. There's a drone shot from the sea that tilts up and reveals Jaffa in 1948. And that's how we introduce, Jaffa in 1948 at the beginning of the film. So we had to rebuild that in visual effects. And it was important to me to really get that right. We used a lot of historical photographs to research and make sure that all of the details were accurate. As a Palestinian, I don't see it as courageous. And I think some people perhaps look at what I'm doing and see it that way. But I think from my point of view, I just see it as sharing our perspective, sharing a perspective that has not really been shown anywhere. And that I think is really vital. It's missing. But it's vital to understanding the Palestinian plight for justice and freedom. And I think that most of the world doesn't really understand that plight. I don't think that you can understand it without really going back in time and understanding how it began. And you can go back much further than 1948 because it began before 48. But 1948 was really, when the state of Israel was created, and you see really like the ethnic cleansing of Palestine that really accelerated in 1948. And you see the dispossession of almost 800,000 Palestinians from their land. That was the beginning of the refugee crisis. That was really when it sort of exploded, and it continued in 1967, which is when my father became a refugee. So I think it's really important to understand that history in order to know how we got to where we are today. It was definitely very emotional. I think especially given what we were witnessing at the time, we shot this film entirely during the genocide. We found ourselves making a film about what was happening as it was happening. We're making a film about the 1948 Nakba as we're watching a much larger Nakba unfold. So it was intensely emotional. And I would say it was emotionally draining, but it was also very cathartic to be able to really grieve. I think that the actors and I talked a lot about that while we were filming, that it almost felt like we were channeling rather than acting. It felt like we were just channeling our grief and the grief that we were witnessing. And it was very cathartic as a tool for just kind of moving through grief. So in a way, it was a gift. Really playing this part was like one of the greatest gifts and one of the greatest challenges of my life. And I think I learned quite a bit from the character, because this is a character who's moving through grief, trying to figure out how to channel her grief into something productive, into something beneficial, and I think that's it's really beautiful to try to do that when we can, when, especially those of us who have privilege, who are not, directly experiencing the violence. I think that in order to really be helpful in this world, it's best not to stay in these negative states of emotion like anger. At least for myself, I find, we look at like the state of anger and it's like, well, anger has never really helped a situation. So what can we do to channel that anger into action, into something that will like really help move the situation forward in some kind of a positive way, or help other people? It's like if you can move your own anger, then maybe you can help other people do the same type of thing. And I think that that's something that I was really exploring in the film as a writer director, but also as an actor, through this part. And it was really beautiful to be able to learn from the character. One of the things that I was really thinking about during the genocide, because, it was hard to, obviously, like horrific to watch and really hard not to feel outraged. And I just kept thinking, how do we not stay in that state? How can I see the anger that's arising right now as a form of compassion? Like, the reason I'm so outraged is because I'm feeling so much compassion for the suffering that I'm seeing. So how can I take this fierce compassion and move it into something that can be helpful? Because staying in a state of anger, I think, and especially rage, which is intense anger, can feel really paralyzing and really disempowering. And I didn't want to stay there. I wanted to really try to channel it into something. And so I really was throwing myself into this film, hoping that this film will awaken compassion in people, and that compassion can help move people towards action to stop the suffering, because I think that that's really what we need right now.